very much for your presence today. This is my great pleasure to introduce Angela Potochnik. Angela is an associate professor at the University of Cincinnati. I think are you the director of the Center for Political Science, something like that? Like inaugural director. I remember there was something specific about it. Angela is also affiliated with the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, also at the University of Cincinnati. Angela got her PhD at Stanford University. She worked with Elliot Sober and Michael Friedman, among others. She has an impressive series of awards and grants as well. I would just mention she's the inaugural recipient of a Rising Star Award at the University of Cincinnati. Sounds super cool to me. She also got the Marjorie Green Prize, which is attributed by the Episcopal Society every other year, which is also a very prestigious award. Angela wrote basically 2 books in a row, it seems. One is this a book, Idealization and the Aims of Science, at the University of Chicago Press. I think that you will hear some of that in the talk today, because causal patterns are an important part of the book. And she also co-wrote a book called Recipes for Science, an introduction to scientific methods and reasoning, with Matteo Colombo and Corey Wright. And it's just out, or almost just out, at Routledge last year. She's also the author of many papers which can be about different topics, including scientific explanation, for example. So some in philosophy of science, scientific explanation, putting communication first. Angela also has a very big interest in something which I think is extremely interesting, which is socially engaged philosophy of science. So she edited a special issue of Erkenntnis in 2014 about exactly that question. As you understood before, she also has interest in logical positivism, Neurath, and topics and people of that category, which I think is extremely interesting as well, and also feminist philosophy of science in different ways. I will not go into the details of everything she has done, but I'm very, very glad we have Angela today. She's also an associate editor of Biology and Philosophy, and Angela was in the UK until yesterday. She very nicely accepted to visit us here in Bordeaux for 2 days, so today and tomorrow. If you want to discuss with Angela after the talk, this is still something that we can arrange. And today, Angela will talk about causal patterns and how our theories change. Thank you very much, Angela.
Thanks, Thomas, and thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks everybody else for showing up and spending your afternoon doing this. I'm really excited to be here. I'm excited to pitch these ideas in this really interesting interdisciplinary context that you all have here that I had hoped to understand the structure of better after lunch, and I don't. But I know that it's interesting, and there's lots of interesting people with different expertise talking to each other. So yeah, excited to be here to talk with you as well. So here's my starting point. I take it that attention to causes, or mechanism, as I think often sort of can be used interchangeably in the sciences, I take it that this is common in biology, as well as I think across all fields of science, I'll say. I'm focusing on biology in particular in this talk, because I think it's maybe closer to the scientific expertise for most of the people in the room have. But a lot of what I want to say today, I think, holds across science. So I'm one of these strange philosophers of science that still want to say something about all of science. So, as I said, attention to causes, I think, or mechanism, is common across biology and other fields of science. Lots of the research, I think, involves search for causes, search for the mechanism for something, right, as it can be said as well, evaluation of the significance of various causes, attention to how different causes interact, etc. There's regularly debate about which causes are important, I take it. So here I have just a smattering of quick ways to illustrate that I'm not in left field here, that this is common. I have a famous explicit discussion of causal processes in evolutionary biology, title of Ernst Mayer's paper, Cause and Effect in Biology. An example of an exploration of causal action, this one has to do with biology as well, in particular possible role of phenotypic plasticity in evolution. And then an example I'll get to in a bit as well, a brief description from the introduction to the Foresight, something called the Foresight Obesity System Atlas, which I will discuss a bit later. So this is just a sort of them explicitly discussing the way in which they're employing causal language in their project. So as I said, this focus on causes is my starting point for my talk today. I want to do three things. First, I'm going to motivate the idea that scientists aim to identify not just causes, but what I call causal patterns. As Thomas mentioned, this relates to my relatively recent book on idealization of the aims of science, and I'll gesture towards how I think what I'm saying today relates to that at some point in the talk. And then I want to explore what I take to be two implications of this idea. First, I think that this view predicts the persistence of multiple accounts of the same phenomenon. So that is a lack of integration across findings in science. And I think that accounts that may seem incompatible actually turn out to be compatible in the sense that they capture different causal patterns, sometimes different causal patterns even involved in the same phenomena. This framing changes how I think we should think about theory development. So that's the last point that I want to make today. I think that theory change, when we, in science, when scientists choose as a field, I guess, or subfield, choose to move on from one theory, from a precursor to a new theory, to change the theoretical framework in some way. I think that can be motivated in two different ways. First, by the discovery that a causal pattern fails to obtain, or second, and I think incredibly importantly, by a shift in the research priorities toward a focus on different causal patterns. So that's where I want to get. So first off, as I said, I want to motivate the idea that scientists aim to identify not just causes, but what I call causal patterns. Our world is a complicated place. In particular, there's something that I like to call causal complexity. What I mean by this is just that phenomena result from a wide range of causal influences, and many of this long list of causal influences interact with one another in a variety of ways. So I'm going to try to attempt to employ my favorite way to illustrate this point about causal complexity. I think it's something that's very quick to say and easy for people to maybe sort of nod about, but I actually think this is pretty profound in both the extent to which it applies to our world and then the significance of it. So my favorite way to illustrate it, I'll need your help. This is why it's written, so I need you to participate. This is a participatory part of my talk. We can consider absolutely any event. Before in other talks I've done this with striking a match, right, to make it seem like a maximally simple event. Because I was interested in moving this towards biology, instead we'll try out the scarlet ibis's coloration. This one. This ibis right here, whichever one this is, right? So we might get to make up some facts about this particular ibis. So there's nothing special, as I said, about this event. Literally anything would work. So what I want to do is to ask you to try to help me brainstorm, work through the causes of this event, or types of causes that we expect would be involved, right? So we don't know, possibly we aren't all complete experts on scarlet ibis. I am not. We don't know that much about this particular one, so you can gesture in the direction of where you expect to find causes, right? Like this might be an evolved trait, for example. So let's try to sort of articulate the range of causal space, if you would. Okay, so again, the question is, can you give me a cause of this event, or a type of cause that you think would be involved in this event? The coloration, this scarlet ibis being the color that it is.
The diet.
It's diet.
Yeah.
Great.
Genetics?
What's that?
The genes?
The genes. Absolutely.
It's beautiful.
It's beautiful. Interesting. I don't know how that's a cause.
Human plus selection, or
Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
Possibly. This could have been a result of, in part, sexual selection, right, on coloration?
Protein expression.
Protein expression.
Paint? Somebody painted?
It could be. If it's a strange scarlet ibis, perhaps it's painted. Yeah, so now we're getting in, so I'm going to rein this in a bit just because I want, as I said, we might need to make up some facts about it, but I want us to tell one single unified story. So it's sort of like a game of telephone. If someone claims a cause, you can't give one that is would result in a different case. So we're assuming this scarlet ibis has the coloration it does because of its diet and something we haven't yet mentioned, right? Its genes, something we haven't yet mentioned, how development has resulted in various metabolic processes, right, that enable it to have, I'm going to lose some of my sciencey words now, but to have sort of this sort of carotenoid capture and differential distribution that we need to have this sort of bright coloration. What else?
And
selected
maybe
for.
gives it a sexual advantage in terms of selection or something?
Excellent, right, so maybe sexual selection, maybe other forms of natural selection,
Oh, artificial selection.
possibly artificial selection as well. I haven't yet heard anything about plasticity. There's a chance, right, that there's some sort of developmental plasticity involved. We also have white ibises, and then I forget which one, but one of them can have, I guess probably a scarlet ibis can have differential coloration depending on the environment. So there's at least some plasticity.
Camouflage.
Camouflage, possibly there's a role for camouflage, which would get back to another possible source of selection involved. All right, let's keep trying to expand out. I don't think we're done yet. We're not done yet. So think about it in this term as well. What kinds of biologists would study this bird? Are there any sort of fields of biology that we don't yet have sort of reference to?
Microbiologist. Maybe the microbiome.
Good.
Co-
Okay, so the microbiome perhaps.
Must be.
And then there's a lot of causal complexity hidden in just some of the brief references we made, right? Like I started to mention that there are different ways in which selection could have been relevant, right? We're not necessarily thinking about the same time slice, right? There could have been a role for sexual selection at some point. Heck, there could have been a role for, I'm sure there was, or I imagine there was, for selection of the use of carotenoids for coloration, right? Farther back phylogenetically. That's one we haven't gotten to. There's certainly phylogenetic causes, right? There's simple sort of common ancestry considerations at work, I imagine, between this bird and at least some other avians. Yeah, developmental processes, environment, behavioral traits. We haven't mentioned that, right? Its behavior is incredibly important here.
Population.
What's that?
Population.
Population? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Population biologists as well, yeah. Metabolic traits we've talked about, genetic, possibly extragenetic or epigenetic inheritance, natural selection. Those were some of the notes I jotted down around the places to look. All right, I'm going to keep sort of sticking with this tiresome exercise because we're not done yet. That's the first bit, right? The second bit, this is just the second step. It's for us to take a deep breath, remember all of the stuff, all of the directions that we pointed, right? To start to sketch out what that story looks like. Now think about some of the things, I don't think we're actually going to get this far down this path, but think about some of the things that cause, some of the things we've talked about as causes, right? Because the causes of causes are themselves causes of the scarlet ibis coloration. Right? Facts about evolvability, possibly there was an evolutionarily distant role for developmental factors. Mutation, excellent, we haven't talked about mutation at all.
Population isolation, low geographical.
Yeah, right.
Isolation.
All right, something to say about speciation, right? Yeah. Okay, so there's some nods. So have I illustrated my point well enough, or should I keep making you bring up?
But there would be also the causes that, if it's the diet, there would be also the causes that cause some sort of food to come in this birdie things.
Excellent,
etc.
thank you.
So
That's really helpful. Yeah, so there are the
It's more
ecological
complex.
facts about the environment of this scarlet ibis, and then there are the evolutionary, genetic, phylogenetic facts about all of the different organisms in this community, especially probably the prey, right? They're important for coloration here. They're also causes of our causes. Okay, so now we're 2/3 of the way there. Causal complexity, right? There are lots of different causes, and we just sort of can expand out arbitrarily far, and we can expand back in time arbitrarily far, I think. So if we had time, of course, and you had patience, we could have, and you all have been remarkably patient, so maybe your patience wouldn't be a limiting factor here. We could, of course, go on, right? I suspect we could keep moving, as I said, outward, so to speak, as well as back in time. And all of these, I think, you can reasonably say count as causes of the scarlet ibis's feather color. At any event, in biological systems or not, as I said, I think you can do the same thing with striking a match. Any event has innumerable causes, causal processes that stretch arbitrarily far back in time. And the last bit, I said we were 2/3 of the way there. These causes interact and often in complex ways. And this is one of the sort of, it seems like, one of the important insights that we have across a number of sciences in the last, I don't know, less than 100 years, maybe especially, is that causal interaction is everywhere, which introduces its own form of complexity. So there are a number of appreciated instances of causal feedback and other complex relationships among causal factors, which further sort of muddies the water. Right? It's not just a matter of counting. You then start to talk about all of the interaction among these different causal factors. And indeed, current scientific practices and methods reflect an awareness of this causal complexity. So here's just one example. It's an example that I use as an illustration in my book on idealization as well. I mentioned already the Foresight Tackling Obesity Project. The goal of that project was to identify all of the major drivers of human obesity. And you can't see anything in this, I'm sorry, but I privilege sort of showing you the whole network over giving you any actual sort of meaty information here. The thing to know is that you have causal arrows. The thickness of the arrow indicates what they found to be the strength of influence, and if it's a dotted arrow instead of a straight line, it's an inhibitory influence instead of a positive contribution. And then these little sort of curved edge rectangles all have within them various traits listed. These colors tell us sort of the different kinds of fields that would study different ranges of these, or you might say what type of phenomena they are. It kind of depends on which item you're talking about: media, social, psychological, food, activity. At any rate, okay. So this is just one map from the resulting atlas, the atlas that resulted from this ambitious project. All right, so even this, one thing I want to point out, I'll make the same point again about causal complexity. Like I said, I think it's tremendous. Even this is only a select part of the total influences on human obesity. Even despite the goal of sort of getting everything out on the page at once, right, they still had to prioritize. They still had to choose what is worth representing here and what can be relegated to the background. Presumably, they focused in on some of the causes, probably the main causes, that vary across humans, right? Because this is a place where we have a sense we might be able to get a handle on how to influence the phenomenon in question. But this is a nice illustration, I think, to show how causal arrows, so to speak, proliferate and how causal factors influence one another. Evidence of causal complexity, I think, also comes from the different approaches that are, as I mentioned, increasingly employed across fields of science, such as, to pick a prominent example, the broad application across fields of dynamical systems theory, I think, is motivated by some of the same facts about our world. All right, so here we are. We're in this causally complex world. Meanwhile, there's some really interesting cognitive science suggesting, or that has looked into what people describe as explanatory, or how they characterize their explanations when they have that sense of grasping an explanation, what's involved. And these cognitive scientists have found that we value causal information about what things brought about the phenomenon that we seek to understand. And this fits perfectly with what I've said so far, right? I started with this idea that science, I think, is by and large sort of interested in analysis of causation, right, or finding mechanisms. But these cognitive scientists have also found that we value general patterns, rules of thumb that make it so that we can predict what will happen in other relevantly similar circumstances. Interesting for my purposes, some research suggests, we also value general patterns even at the cost of some accuracy. So we tend to err on the side of overgeneralizing, focusing in on patterns and ignoring exceptions to those patterns. So as one would hope, or as one would hope if one is a philosopher at least, this also does mirror some popular broad philosophical ideas about scientific explanation that have to one degree or another, really dominated the last several decades in philosophy. The first and inarguably sort of most significant of those is this idea that explanation often, at least, involves the identification of causes, right? So philosophers have been focused on giving causal accounts of explanation, or how you can generate scientific explanations by invoking causes for most of the last century. But the second thread, which is perhaps less well developed, but certainly there as well, is the idea that in philosophy that scientific explanation also involves a kind of identification of laws, right? It's kind of where we start as a field about 100 years ago when it comes to scientific explanation, or patterns, right? And both laws and patterns, I think, evoke this second point that I made, that we humans, it seems, find general patterns, right? Rules of thumb to be explanatory, to be enlightening. Okay, so here's my conjecture. Scientists are not simply aiming to provide causal information, but to characterize causal patterns, or I think how we can understand causal patterns, how I'd like to understand causal patterns in this context, how the influence of focal causes tends to play out in a complex phenomenon. So that word focal is important here, right? So we're focusing in on one or more, could be quite many causes, but some subset of all of the many causes bound up in a complex phenomenon, and aiming to tease out how those focal causes are at work in this phenomenon. So why? I think we have at least one basic story on the table for why this might be. We talked about causal complexity. We live in this unbelievably complex world, and we're cognitively limited agents. We can't grapple all of the foresighted tackling obesity map, let alone all of the stuff that's in the background of that map all at once. But I think that's not quite right, or it's not the best way to frame it. There is this, I think, basic mismatch between causal complexity of the world and cognitive limitations of people, of us, scientists and the audience of science included. But I think there's a better way to phrase that. Cognitive limitations can be put positively instead. As I was just saying, there's something, it seems to be said, about the cognitive value, at least to us, maybe in general, of simple patterns, right? So you can turn that on its head and make it a positive observation. Simple patterns are key, it seems, to our understanding, and they're key to, I think less controversially, they're key to control, right? When you can identify simple patterns, and you have a sense in relevantly similar circumstances, what you can do to bring about the same outcome or to forestall the same outcome if you want things to change. All right. So we live in this complicated mess of a world with lots of causes that combine in unexpected, infinitely variable ways, partly because of all of that complex causal interaction. And our ability to understand and shape our world is furthered by the identification of simple patterns. So what do? I'm suggesting that we focus in on the factors that we're interested in, right? Some small subset, usually, of the causal complexity that we're faced with. And we try to ignore the other stuff. We put all of the rest in the background. This often requires artificially simplifying the parts of the story that we aren't interested in to improve our access to the parts that we are interested in. So I mentioned I'd sort of point out a connection to my recent book. My recent book focuses on this largely, particularly with an eye to how the simplification, right, it's the simplifying the other parts of the story that we aren't interested in, how that is accomplished, which is, I think, an important use of idealizing assumptions in science. But today I want to focus in particular on the role of our interests in deciding which causal pattern is focal, something I've already said, but I think sort of bears pausing and thinking about a bit more. If I'm right that scientists generally aim to uncover and make use of causal patterns, I think this changes the expectations for when a cause needs to be taken into account. So remember all of the influences on scarlet ibis coloration that you all very generously sort of helped me assemble a list of. If the aim were simply to characterize the causes, right? If we want to know what are the causes of this amazing phenomenon, this would motivate an exhaustive story of the highly specific combination of influences that happen to bear on this phenomenon. We would see all of our biologists and any other scientists who have an interest in the ibis working together to amass all of the causal information we have about this bird. But I don't think that's what we see happening. I do think interdisciplinarity and interdisciplinary collaboration across fields is really important, but I don't think we see that happening. Rather, what I think happens is that a biologist comes to her investigation of some organism with specific interests. She's interested in the evolution of carotenoid metabolism and selective transport in birds, or possibly whether and in what ways sexual selection is responsible for carotenoid coloration, or how, something we hadn't mentioned I think, how parasite load influences carotenoid metabolism and selective transport, or, right, the list could go on. We could do the same thing we did for the causes, and we'll come up with all of these different legitimate scientific interests that could occasion a focus research on the scarlet ibis. So I would characterize this as a question of which causal pattern the biologist is interested in. Causal patterns may be more general, like carotenoid metabolism across all birds, or more nuanced, like how several of these causal factors happen to combine for the scarlet ibis in particular. Notice, if the aim is to characterize a causal pattern, the first question is not what are the causes, right, the place that we started before, but rather, which causes, right? Which causes are we interested in, right? It's a question about us, or about the scientist doing the research, or the audience that the science imagines for her research. And this is a question of research priorities. If I'm right that causal patterns are the aim, then given these research interests, sorry, let me back up one step. It's a question of research priorities. Research priorities, I think, shape what causal information is relevant. If I'm right that causal patterns are the aim, then given these specific research interests that occasion investigation of some natural phenomenon, given those interests, adding more causal information about what brought about this phenomenon is not only not needed, it's actually contraindicated, right? You're obliterating the causal pattern that you're out to uncover by adding in extraneous information. All right, so this emphasis on causal patterns predicts the persistence, I think, of multiple accounts of the same phenomenon. Accounts that may seem incompatible, but that capture different causal patterns. This is the source of what I suggested was what I think is a lack of integration in science. As will become clear, I mean in particular by this lack of integration among, we might say, scientific explanations, or I think it works to just say more generically accounts. I think that there is a lack of integration among our scientific accounts. I'll start by focusing on evolutionary biology as one of the fields to which the scarlet ibis is of interest. It's also not entirely a coincidence that I'm coming straight from an evolutionary biology conference. I think evolutionary biology is naturally construed as a search for causal patterns. So classically, at least, this might be a longer list than this, but just to motivate the idea that evolutionary biology can be understood as a search for causal patterns, there's the question of the causal role of common descent on one or another organism trait, the causal role of natural selection on traits, which genes cause which traits, right? This is at least a partial list of the sort of causal patterns that it seems evolutionary biologists have been up to investigating. And perhaps more recently, I think this expands outward, and you see at least some evolutionary biologists also thinking about whether developmental processes are ever important to consider as an influence, a causal influence on evolution. The question of whether natural selection is a cause of different forms of evolution, or selection, put a different way, whether selection can act at larger scales or smaller scales than the individual, or in whatever your favorite sense of selection is. Questions about macroevolutionary causal patterns, right? And whether these simply are microevolutionary patterns, or whether there's something else that needs to be said there. And then thinking about the possibility of epigenetic inheritance or non-genetic entities playing a causal role in inheritance, as well as genes. All right, so this is a long list of, I take it, just some, but at least some. I doubt it's exhaustive, of the causal patterns that it seems like evolutionary biologists investigate some or another of. So notice that these are, at least on my view, these are all distinct causal patterns from one another, right? If you have a complete answer about some organism or some phenomenon for one of these, that doesn't mean that you know about the others as well. But because of causal complexity, many of these patterns can arise in the same phenomenon, in any given evolutionarily relevant phenomenon. I'm using phenomenon a lot here, as this is sort of generic way of pointing at the world, right? The stuff that we study, or that scientists study. So many of these patterns that are in this list can arise in the same phenomenon. So consider all the things there are to say, again, about the scarlet ibis and how those relate to the research topics that I've indicated here. So this predicts that it's common to have multiple different accounts of even the same phenomenon, right? Like scarlet ibis coloration, each of which depicts a causal pattern focal to some specific research aim. So I think this is so within evolutionary biology, and I think it's even more obviously so across field boundaries. So for example, between an investigation in evolutionary biology and a separate investigation in developmental biology, right? Developmental biologists who don't care a bit about evolution could still be quite interested in our scarlet ibis. And so I think I'm making this point in a very sort of small scientific area, right, in evolutionary biology, but I think as much as it's true there, it just sort of is true in easier to indicate ways, sort of as you scale out and look at other fields of science. Again, so long as they tend to be interested in the same kind of phenomenon as one another, that is. Okay, so it may seem like all of these causal patterns, I'm emphasizing this lack of integration, all of these causal patterns simply add up to a complete account of the phenomenon, right? If you learn about all of the different causes separately, you put all of that on a page, and what do you have? You have a complete account. But I don't think it works out that way in practice, and for important reasons. These different accounts of the various causal patterns bound up in any given phenomenon can't simply be integrated. First of all, each account is only partly accurate of the phenomenon, right? You've sort of captured the part of the story that's of interest given the specific research program at hand, and to that end, misrepresented, neglected to the extent possible, and misrepresented other parts of the story to accommodate that purpose, right? So you have these sort of seemingly incompatible treatments of the very same phenomenon, given these different aims occasioning it. And as I said, I think that lack of integration is principal. There are important advantages to the separate accounts. I'm just sort of glossing over this really quickly here, so if you want to talk more about it during question time afterwards, we can do that. But I think there are important advantages to maintaining these separate accounts of the different causal patterns bound up in some phenomenon. So for example, this makes available certain mathematical modeling techniques that wouldn't be available if we tried to grapple with all the causes at once, right? And that need doesn't go away. So it's not as if you can then come up with a model that actually brings in back in all the other causal complexity, in many cases anyway. And especially, I think that there is, as I've already suggested, a contribution to human understanding of simple patterns, right? And everything that I said earlier, about the value to human understanding of grasping simple patterns, that gets lost when you complicate the pattern, right, to bring in everything together, when you try to integrate. All right, so here's how I think this plays out in an example of possible research directions in evolutionary biology. Consider research on phenotypic plasticity and its potential evolutionary role as a speedy form of environmental responsiveness, and thus as one possible initial source of novel traits. I've just learned there's a catchphrase for this. I didn't realize this, but plasticity first, right? The plasticity first people. I didn't know they had a name. Now I do. So in my view, that interest, right? We just talked about research on how phenotypic plasticity may play this potential evolutionary role. I don't think that replaces an account of the role of natural selection in bringing about some trait, but instead it stands alongside it, right? So even if the plasticity first people are right, and this is really evolutionary significant, let's just say it happens, to make the example extreme, just across the board, right? Evolution always or almost always starts with plasticity. I think there's still good research to be done in just focusing on the role of the role that selection played and how evolution played out there, right? And this is because you can focus on the causal pattern around the role of natural selection, or you can focus on the causal role of plasticity. These are sort of two different projects, neither of which threatens the other. And in fact, it's a bit more than that. There are two different causal patterns, at least, that one can consider with regards to phenotypic plasticity. Simply whether phenotypic plasticity is an influence on the trait, right? We already talked about that. And then as well as the separate question, and this last meant the separate question, which is, to be represented by this last box. And this one is something like aiming for an integrated account, right? The separate question of whether phenotypic plasticity, the causal role of phenotypic plasticity, meaningfully interacts with the evolutionary question, right? With the selection of the trait, or more generally, the evolution of the trait. All right, so I just wanted to sort of play around in here, still, I know in a very abstract way, but around particular research questions and how they occasion focus on different causal patterns, just as a way of trying to illustrate how it seems, first of all, as if these hopefully motivate the intuition for you that these research programs don't undermine one another, right? And nor do they necessarily call out for a form of integration. And this third possible research program, I'm hoping will illustrate something like an integrated focus, which is, I think, absolutely, maybe increasingly an important scientific focus, and thereby make clear, I'm not saying this doesn't happen. The only point I want to make about a lack of integration is that this more integrated project that brings together questions about the causal role of multiple factors at once, this doesn't replace the earlier research programs. It's just yet another body of research on top of hormones, I think. Okay, so as that suggests, this view predicts a proliferation of accounts of any given phenomenon that is of interest in the context of different research programs, right? As long as different types of scientists have reason to look at some phenomenon, we're going to end up with multiple accounts, possibly a proliferation of accounts about that phenomenon. Because of this, I think it sometimes happens that scientists take themselves to disagree when they are actually after different things. So this is a point that I couldn't resist making just in passing. I motivate something like this idea in this older paper that I published in Bioscience. The idea that differences in theoretical commitments across the field of biology, I suspect, can arise more often from differences in research aims than from actual rifts in theory, right? So maybe even when it seems like we have radical differences in commitment to theory, I think if we look, and that something needs to change, right? This needs to be resolved. I think that sort of looking closely can often make clear that there are different research priorities that motivate those theoretical differences, right? So that all is well after all. So one may reasonably ask whether this view, that is the general view I've been motivating of this lack of integration and the proliferation of accounts of any given phenomenon, whether this lets other approaches, right, lets theories off the hook too easily. Is it too hard, one can ask, and people have asked, is it too hard to generate genuine disagreement if we accept something like my view here? As you might guess, I don't think it is. I don't think it's too hard to generate disagreement. Indeed, this is the launching point I want for my last idea for this talk. I think that this account actually sharpens our sense for what motivates actually jettisoning an account. That is what actually motivates theory change. And so here we are. This is my last point, I promise. I want to talk about how an idea, some conjectural general ideas about how our theories change in science. The ideas I have advocated, I think, change how we should think about theory development in biology, and as I suggested earlier, I think what I say for biology holds more generally here as well. If what I've said is right, the identification of a neglected cause, right, recognizing, hey, this is causally important and your theory doesn't talk about it, that isn't in itself a reason to revise a theory. I've suggested that scientists do not and should not aim for integrated accounts, but rather introduce additional accounts that help us grasp new causal patterns, including patterns in the interaction of multiple causal factors when this is of research interest. So on this view though, so I've said, right, just finding a causal identifying a cause that a theory doesn't accommodate isn't a reason to get rid of that theory. But I do think that there are two distinct motivations that arise from this kind of a perspective, two distinct motivations for updating our theories. First of all, we can, and scientists regularly have throughout the history of science, discover that some causal pattern that our theory tells us to expect fails to obtain, right? It is still possible for an account or a scientific theory to be wrong on the kind of view that I'm proposing. As I said, it's not enough that we just find that there's some causal factor out there that this causal pattern neglects, right, that doesn't feature in the causal factor. But something stronger is needed. Putting it abstractly, if a causal factor is found that's incidental to the theory, and it turns out that it messes up that causal pattern that was predicted, then you have trouble with your theory, right? So I will try to illustrate that in just a second, but I want to mention the second distinct motivation first. So one thing that can go wrong, on my view, is that we thought we had an account that of some causal pattern, and we learn that causal pattern doesn't play out that way, right? So the theory is just wrong. We have to improve it. We have to change it in some way. Second motivation, which is fully distinct, is our research priorities can shift. Our research priorities can shift toward a focus on different causal patterns and away from a focus on the causal pattern that we get with some theoretical structure. So I've made clear, I think, how the first of these options is a weaker requirement for theory accuracy than is customary, right? Just not saying something, leaving out some fact is not sufficient. But the second motivation for theory change expands the grounds for theory revision into not only just what's true about our world, but what it is that we want our theories to accomplish. And I think that's important. I think this actually does some important work, both in the history of science and also in thinking about various debates in biology and other fields today. So as I said, I'll try to illustrate both of these, and in particular, I will again return to evolutionary biology, and in particular, some of the ideas that have been raised in the context of this the call for an expanded evolutionary synthesis to illustrate some of these. So recall that expanded list that I gave you of the sort of patterns, causal patterns that evolutionary biologists are investigating. The expanded synthesis advocates are sort of not central to this talk at all. The main thing that I'm doing by invoking that message is indicating that the sort of evolutionary biology I'm talking about includes these sort of bullet points as proper topics in evolutionary theory. I gather not all evolutionary biologists agree with that. And the second reason I want to focus in here on those who advocate an extended synthesis is it's helpful to sort of grab onto some specific scientists and what they say and what they think about the relationship between their views and existing theory if we're talking about theory change. So that's why I'm moving to this specific example here. All right. So my first option here for updating theory, right? I think that my view predicts that scientific theory will be updated when we discover that the causal pattern featured in this theory or account doesn't obtain, that it actually doesn't work out that way. This is the sort of thing that advocates of evolutionary developmental biology claim about at least some traits, right? The claim is not that all evolved traits are this way, but that in at least some range of phenomena, that there simply is no causal pattern in how selection influenced the trait, except for if you take into account developmental processes, right? So my interpretation of that claim is, right, evolutionary developmental biologists are saying, evolutionists, you need to listen to us. And the reason is, things don't work the way that you think they are. Not just that you're not telling us about development, right? But that in these cases where you think you've given us a story for how a trait has evolved, you've gotten that story wrong. Because developmental processes are so significant in some of these cases that there is no story to tell unless you go through, go via knowledge of developmental processes, something like that. So I'm not saying that's right or wrong, right? My point is just, I think that there's good sense to be made of that sort of a claim with this sort of a framework. In particular, that this is the claim that traditional evolutionary theory identifies causal patterns that in lots of phenomena fail to obtain because they've missed some crucial causal detail that interferes with the pattern otherwise. The second, though, I've already said that I think that a shift in or expansion of research priorities is a nice way to understand at least an element of theory change in science. And I think this is a nice way to interpret much of the motivation behind the calls that there have been for an extended evolutionary synthesis. So I'll try to illustrate that. So for example, Massimo Pigliucci and Gerd Mueller have this collection from 2010 that brings together a range of work by those who are advocating extended synthesis and some related researchers. And in their introduction to that collection, they say the following. They say, one may ask whether any of the general principles of the population dynamical core of the classical theory are compromised by these new views. The new views here, right, they're sort of extended synthesis ideas in this volume. They say, well, no. The concepts we bring together in this volume, for the most part, do not concern population dynamics, our understanding of which is improved but not fundamentally altered by the new results. Rather, the majority of the new work concerns problems of evolution that had been sidelined. So what I hear in this, right, as I'm interpreting in this sort of framework that I'm urging in this talk, I hear in this, well, we're not actually telling you your causal patterns don't work, but we're shifting the questions. We're saying you focused on these, on this population dynamical core, right, and there are actually problems in evolution that are cut off by that approach, that you're not actually getting an account of. And I think that's pretty naturally interpreted as a call for a shift in research priorities, an expansion out into sort of questions that, in the view of these biologists anyway, aren't adequately addressed by current theory. Okay, so shortly after this, I'll say just a bit more about this particular example. Shortly after this, Pigliucci and Mueller outline what they take to be 3 restrictions they're opposing the extended synthesis to the modern synthesis, right? But of, I think, we could just say 3 restrictions that they take to be true, restrictions put in place by the population, what they call the population dynamical core of classical theory. So these are, on their view, again, sort of the specifics of their view are not what I'm advocating here, gradualism, right? So according to them, classical theory, classical evolutionary theory, posits gradualism, or the continuous and incremental genetic variation. Externalism, right? So the idea being that classical theory has the restriction in their term of the view that it's external factors, external to the organism, that drive trait evolution, and then gene centrism, the idea that the gene is the sole agent of variation in inheritance. It replaces the gene at the center of evolution. All right, so as I said, I'm a little bit worried I'm not able to create enough context for this, but these are, so I'll say it one more time, these are 3 ideas that Pigliucci and Mueller claim are core to classical evolutionary theory, and they say that they are restrictions, right? They're criticizing classical theory. They're saying that it's restricted in these 3 ways. So given everything that I've been up to in this talk, I'm going to suggest instead that these 3 so-called restrictions should be taken to be idealizations, or pretty simple, simplifying assumptions, right? They're a way of sort of simplifying out parts of the story that aren't central to some kinds of work in evolutionary biology. And as such, they, I think, continue to be appropriate to research into certain kinds of causal patterns, like the role of selection and the role of genetic inheritance, right? These can still be, in these certain systems, this can still be, I think, apt simplifying assumptions. But on the other hand, these assumptions are patently inappropriate and unhelpful for other kinds of research into other causal patterns, including the kind of research that advocates of the extended synthesis urge, right? So I want to say, wait, hold on, we don't have to jettison classical evolutionary theory, we don't have to jettison its simplifying assumptions. Some sorts of evolutionary biology projects are well served by those, but with your call to expand research priorities, right, you're saying, well, let's relax those assumptions and consider, with an eye towards different causal patterns, what happens when niche construction is important to an evolutionary outcome. Let's try to get a story for that part as well. All right, so this isn't to minimize the importance of these kinds of theory changes. I actually think, the pattern exemplified by the advocates of the extended synthesis of, hold on everybody, there are these theoretical assumptions. Do we really want to make those assumptions? I think that's a really important kind of discussion for scientists to have. So I'm not minimizing the importance of that. Certainly don't mean to minimize the role here for shifting research priorities, right? For changes in research focuses that can motivate these kinds of conversations. Rather, I think these are exceedingly important, as I said, both for understanding the history of science and also to contemporary scientific change. Diagnosing the role of different or shifting research priorities in theory change helps clarify how our interests, the interests of our scientists, the interests of the audience for science, can shape the nature of our science, and legitimately so, right? There's nothing spooky or sort of unfair about the way in which research priorities are structuring research on this field. Our research priorities simply determine which causal patterns we seek to understand, right? And the recognition of causal complexity brings with it the recognition that understanding a given causal pattern is never the complete story. Okay, and so to summarize, I've suggested that the widespread scientific focus on causation or mechanism should be interpreted as an aim to identify causal patterns, or patterns in how some focal cause or causes exert their influence. The aim of depicting causal patterns means that our body of research regarding any given phenomenon is not integrated, not a synthetic whole, but a variety of different accounts of how that phenomenon embodies different causal patterns of interest, causal patterns that extend into different ranges of phenomena from one another as well, something I haven't talked about today. Finally, these ideas predict that theories aren't simply updated whenever a causal factor is found to be neglected, right? That's not, nothing's gone wrong if our theories don't talk about all of the causes involved in the phenomena that are treated by the theory. But rather, our theories are updated when we decide that the neglect is problematic, either because it interferes with the causal pattern that's of direct interest, that the theory, the role that the theory is supposed to play, or else by helping to shift our research interests to new patterns entirely. All right, thanks.
Thank you, Angela. So I will ask you to introduce yourself in 10 seconds just for Angela to know if you're a philosopher, if you're a scientist, if you're a medical doctor. Come on.
Okay, I'm Thomas. I'm a philosopher of science, postdoc in the University of Bordeaux. I have two quick questions there. And first, thank you very much. I really like the talk. So I kind of have doubts about how you might answer that, but I just want to have an explicit answer of how your account differs from Mitchell's integrative pluralism.
Good.
And the second question is whether your account says something about disagreement within a given perspective. So you were saying something about valuing disagreements between different perspectives or different perspectives picking causal accounts and how this has value for epistemic values, but if your account says something about when there is disagreement within a given perspective, let's say within people arguing for the evolutionary extended synthesis, or whether you think it's a different topic that
Okay.
someone's.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so as far as how this relates to Mitchell's integrative pluralism, I think we're up to lots of the same things, and she's certainly, her work is certainly inspirational or influential in how I think about science. I think the main difference is that my understanding is that Sandy wants to emphasize the ways in which we bring together all of these different accounts and integrate them in one, for some particular phenomenon, in order to sort of figure out that phenomenon. So I don't think that happens very often. I think it's highly unusual for that to happen in science. I think that it can happen, like I've wanted to emphasize along the way here, that I'm not saying the scientists never integrate, but I think that it's expensive, resource intensive to bring together a lot of different accounts. It takes a ton of work. It can involve developing new theoretical or mathematical apparatus to do that. And so I think that only happens in, that I can think of two specific kinds of cases. One is when this whole suite of different kinds of causes come together in roughly the same way, in a patterned way, across a lot of different phenomena, right? So you still get kind of a broad, interesting pattern, even with a relatively integrated account. I still don't think that that's bringing to bear everything we know on some given phenomenon. I think there's still this kind of zoomed out pattern that's the goal. So that's one of the instances. The other instance that I can think of is, again, it goes back to our interest, when it just happens that we really care about something that happened. Maybe it only happened once, maybe it will only ever happen once, but it's the sort of thing that we really want to understand it in all of its intricacy. So an example of that is maybe the evolution of large brains in hominids, right? Maybe this only happened once, but like, what led to that, you know? Who even cares, for some research interests, who even cares if it was, if it is so evolutionarily unlikely that it will never come about again? We just want to know, how do things interact to make this happen once? And so I can imagine those sorts of cases, this kind of extensive integration being warranted. So I don't think integration happens that much. That was too long an answer to your first question. So I have to be brief for your second question. I'm trying to remember it now. Oh yeah, disagreement within sort of theoretical frameworks. I don't know. So I haven't really thought about that in this context. I suspect that there are a few different things to say. So this isn't, I think, an account, maybe to support that answer, the generic answer I just gave. I don't think this is works as a general account of what disagreement is in science, but I think it is an attempt, it's a sort of a hypothesis about what we might be able to say when someone is calling for theory change, how we might be able to adjudicate whether theory change is warranted, and if so, why. So I'm hoping it does something like that. I do think there are probably lots of different kinds of disagreement that this doesn't capture. Maybe I'll stop there. Yeah.
Daniel Kostic, philosopher, postdoc, working with Cedric in his project. Thanks very much. I really like the talk, and I really like the idea about patterns being explanatory and the role of patterns in heuristics and theory changing. But I have a question that might seem blunt, on the face of it, but I think it will help to understand better what you mean by patterns.
Okay.
So the question is, where are the patterns? Causal patterns, right? So, for example, in Woodward's account of explanation, he also talks, you can also understand the interventionist account of explanation as a talk about patterns, but these causal patterns, are actually patterns of counterfactual causal dependencies that remain invariant under interventions, right? So the counterfactual dependencies don't really exist. These are just, that's not a pattern in the world, right? So that's something that is just hypothetical, that is postulated by the explanation, right?
If we're dealing with a phenomenon that's just happened once, so you can say something counterfactual about it, but you can't sort of
Right, yeah.
Okay.
So he has problems with regularities. And so, in that sense, would you allow that patterns are not just ontic patterns of causal relations, or you allow some more abstract patterns, and then if you allow that, then would you allow some non-causal patterns to be explanatory? So you can
Good.
go
Yeah.
with idealizations. So you start with a causal pattern that is in the world, you exhaustively describe something, and then you idealize, remove irrelevant details until you end up with some non-causal pattern that
I
is
see, yeah.
explanatory.
So as I think you already know, I make a lot of Woodward's understanding of causation with this, and I think that's, for me, it's a really natural way to talk about causation. I think it tracks a lot of scientific discussion, a lot of what I want to emphasize about patterns really well. So I think causal patterns are real, and I think I need a commitment to at least some watered down way in which we can talk counterfactually in a way that tracks something about reality, right, in order to do that. So that might be part of an answer to the first question you asked, although I made it as easy on myself as I could. But something in there is where I want to land. Now, what does it mean for a causal pattern to be real? I don't know. Some stuff I'm not a metaphysicist.
Metaphysician.
There we go. So I don't know. It's real in the way that all this other stuff that's sort of non-problematically real is real. I don't think that's a particularly sort of spooky claim to make. So then you wanted to ask about non-causal patterns. This is an interesting question, and I've tried to answer it for you before. I might repeat myself. You got to forgive me if I do, because same question. So I am open to the possibility that in some pockets in science, the sort of patterns that are enlightening turn out to be non-causal, right? That they aren't naturally articulated in the Woodwardian, flip this lever and you get this lever to flip, right? That sort of breaks down. I'm open to that possibility. I haven't yet been convinced of any examples, and I also probably haven't done that good of a job of systematically looking for those examples, but the different styles, flavors I've seen of philosopher of science advocating non-causal explanations, anyway, I think they divide into different types of advocacies for that, and so I won't try to go through them, but just to say, so far I haven't found one of those grounds that sort of fits right. And in particular, when you raise this idea that you might sort of abstract away enough that you get a representation of, maybe even of the causal system, but that it itself is non-causal. I don't find that very compelling, and the reason is that I am so comfortable in applying Woodwardian-like counterfactual, in thinking of Woodwardian-like counterfactual dependencies as causal dependencies. And so I also haven't found a description by a philosopher of science of an instance where you get something that is so cordoned off from causal dependencies in the world that I think it's not natural to call that a representation of a causal pattern.
I'll send you some stuff that might change your mind.
Okay, all right. There's one other little thing I was going to add to that, but I don't remember what it was.
But for Woodward, can I follow up?
If it's quick,
It is quick? Okay, maybe we could talk about it later. I wanted to say for Woodward, it's not that is explanatory. It is counterfactual information that is explanatory, right? So it's not the actual real pattern that you find in the world. It's not just the actual real pattern. It's all the different ways that, you might change the pattern that could, and
Yeah,
that
we should talk more.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have a quick one to that. Yeah, we should talk about it.
Cedric.
Yeah, so Cedric Blanc, philosopher. Thank you first for the talk. It was really enlightening. Just a question about fields. Scientific fields that are apparently unified in the sense of they have the same broad kind of aim,
Okay.
or not only topic but really aim. They want to explain some kind of similar things, but that are so much divided into subfields that you lack the unity of the kind of causal pattern that is relevant or common to all levels. I don't want to use the levels, but to all focus of each subdiscipline. So for me, the best example is neuroscience, also because that's the one I know best. But I think we have exactly this case where you have an entire macro discipline that is aiming almost at the same thing, explaining behavior, let's say, something like that, or even if there are some clinical aspect like treating some diseases that impact on the behavior or the cognitive abilities, but something like that. And however, they cannot agree on a common research program, on a common kind of causal pattern that they should look into, and even on the kinds of model that they will use that would be shareable, or like a currency between them to share or integrate their work. So I was wondering how can you make sense of that?
Yeah. Well, what I suspect is that in the sense I want to think about it, they don't actually have the same names, right? Like I think we're actually benefited from really sort of spelling out the aim of some research program in agonizing detail, probably more than scientists themselves would even want to do, because I think you can get so much accounted for when you're sort of really precise on what the aim is. Abstractly, my guess would be disagreements largely arise from straight up different aims. This is the list. This is just the first thing on the list. Or different aims such that even when there are overlapping types of patterns or types of phenomena of interest, priority is placed on different ranges of those, right? So that the ones that seem to be really important work different ways. And so you actually disagree about what's really important, what kinds of systems, right? Or kinds of factors because of the different kinds of systems. Disagreement about whether some causal pattern actually obtains, right? And that can be, I think, more complicated than I've suggested here. I've just suggested, well, if it turns out the pattern, there is no pattern without mentioning some factor that's neglected, then you're in trouble, there's no pattern. But I think it's a lot more complicated because with the different aims, these I think very finely distinguished aims, comes different expectations for how much fidelity you need to have a pattern, for what range of phenomena need to be encompassed in the pattern, etc. And so all of that I think muddies the water. So I think there are all these different dimensions in which scientists can disagree in that context. And I bet that you can sort of diagnose any individual case in sort of those sorts of ways, and some combination of those.
Thank you.
Jan-Pieter Kansman, neuroimmunologist, with an interest in philosophy. So I would like to go back a little bit to the lack of integration. And I think what became clear in your first answer is that it's not in principle impossibility. It's just very hard and takes a lot of energy and time, and I agree with that. But I'd just like to have your thoughts on incorporating then your interest in science communication to society. Don't you think it would be worthwhile trying to come up with integration to communicate better or more easily? And I'm just thinking about the obesity map you show, because my feeling of that is that the effort to integrate was maybe motivated as well by realizing repeatedly that the simplistic patterns that have been proposed do not adequately account for the phenomena of interest. And that therefore, maybe we cannot come up with a full synthesis, and you show perfectly well how complex, and that we, as limited cognitive beings, we cannot make any sense of it. But at least it has the merit of showing that the simplistic patterns are too simplistic. And I think that's very important already.
Yeah.
And maybe one of the reasons why these simplistic patterns prevail in science is because it's so easy for us to reason in one cause, one consequence. And so I agree with you that it's very difficult to get to integration, but I also sense that you say it's hard and sometimes impossible because all the accounts are partial, which I agree to a large extent as well. But oftentimes there is partial overlap in the accounts. And for example, in the experimental conditions, there are at least partial overlaps possible. So could that be possible starting points for integration? And so first question is, do you think it's worthwhile to go for integration at all? And if so, how?
Thanks. Yeah, those are great questions. So I think providing an integrated account can absolutely be a proper scientific aim, right? But what you probably hear already in that answer is I think it's an aim. And so one of the things I wanted to stress in the sort of lack of integration part of the talk is I don't think that replaces any other aims that you could have, right? So for example, for research into obesity, right? Hopefully this was a valuable exercise, right? I can imagine, as you suggested, maybe some of the ways in which it could have been, it could be really valuable. I don't think it probably replaced, this is probably obvious, but I don't think it replaced the need, and I'm sure it didn't replace the actual research into, the role of exercise on, obesity, the role, for any of the individual factors, I think. And so that's really the point I want to make about integration, is not that we shouldn't aim for integrated accounts, but I think that when we do, I think there's going to be something to say about the specific aim of that account and why it warranted integration. And I think that's going to be yet another account on top of all our accounts.
Be
I don't
more
think it'll replace
explicit
anything.
about why we want to integrate. I mean,
Yeah, that's right. And not expect that integration to be better than or to replace non-integrated, for lack of a better term, accounts. There's something else. Oh yeah, the with the public. I think that can, and I can imagine circumstances in which that can play a role in helping with public engagement science to sort of create, at least gesture towards some forms of integrated knowledge on some front. But I think, now this is really pie in the sky probably, but I think it's probably even more important for a broader sort of public understanding of science to educate people when they're learning about science to not expect a single integrated story, right? But and thus to have, this is, dispute among scientists is a really key topic in public understanding of science, of course, and for people to thereby have a framework to interpret disagreement, or even like apparent disagreement, different things being said by different scientists who study the same thing, and to not hear that as scientists don't know, I think would be incredibly valuable.
Right.
So I think integration could be helpful, but appreciating the lack of integration is so much more helpful, I think, or would be so much more.
No one else before Daniel? Okay, Anne? No.
Sorry. So I'm Anne. I come from a philosophical background. So my question is, if there is a lack of synthesis because of different research aims, how should we understand the construction of research aims? Do you think we should look for a sociological point of view, or does it depend on the object of science itself?
As far as what our aim should be?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is an incredibly important question. So that's one of the things I want to emphasize, a way of sort of boosting the practical appeal of this kind of account is on this sort of a view of science. It puts front and center, what did we choose to study? Because I tell you what, that's going to downstream determine what we know. And at some level, we all appreciate that. But I think, if I'm right, that's actually a really nuanced consideration, and it can lead us in different directions, I think that's an absolutely central question for us to be asking repeatedly and constantly, about all of our different forms of sciences, what are our priorities here? And back to the sort of public relationship between public and science, and for the research priorities in science to relate in the right ways to to the public good, right? And so that's really messy, and I don't know what that looks like, but I take it that the need for that sort of consideration and a view of how crucial that sort of process is determining the output of our scientific project is I think, a nice thing about this kind of account. And I'll add too, because it fits kind of along the same lines. I think this also, less so just what I've focused on today, but I think this also brings front and center the way in which who is doing our science, who is funding our science, et cetera. All these things are so crucial in what we actually know about our world. And I think this sort of raises the salience of that, I hope.
I have a follow-up question on this, if possible. I think your example suggested that many different types of phenomena can lead to the attempt to find some causal patterns. But I think there's really, many phenomena are not going to count as explananda in science. So for example, the color of the ibis or the bird is not a scientific object. It's not, there's no scientific program or anything like that called, I'm the Society for the Color of this. We do have societies for obesity or journals and also for evolution, for example. So the phenomena you described, I think, must be maybe considered depending on whether or not they will lead to, be constituted by the scientific community as a meaningful explanandum. And among those, then the question becomes, how do we decide, how do we make them, and the sociological aspects of that are very important. But I think there's a very big difference here, and we need to agree on what which phenomena are going to count as explananda.
Good. Yeah, good. That's helpful. So one thing I want to say about that is, there's a reason that I said, think about that ibis, that one right there, right? Because as soon as we start to get to the sort of objects that are properly of scientific interest, then we're already talking about patterns, right? And we're already cutting down the number of causal influences under consideration accordingly, right? And so if we look at an actual concrete event, there are very few circumstances where scientists are after an account of this actual concrete event, but it can be sort of tethered to these sort of proper, these patterns that are of research interest, but already moving to the pattern sort of gets us some way towards carving out the bit that we care about, right? So anyway, I hope that was clear, what I was trying to articulate then. I had a follow-up thought. What else was my other thought that I want to say about that? I lost it. Is there something else I was supposed to respond to?
Well, I don't know, but one point of what I was saying is that integration will be dependent on the level of generality of the phenomenon or the phenomena that you're going to consider. So I think this is very important to distinguish among those levels of generality and the phenomenon of interest. That will, the consequences will major on all the aspects you mentioned. The kind of causal pattern we'll try to find for explaining, evil-devil phenomena will be very different, I think, and the question of integration will be very different in that case and in the case of explaining obesity, for example, or in the case of explaining this and that, which will not necessarily count as a scientific phenomenon. So it was just a general. Daniel and Miss Daniel again?
It's just a quick question. Do you differentiate between unification, integration, and synthesis? Because all the three notions are kind of acknowledged pluralism in science and are non-reductive, and
I think it depends
or
on
they're interchangeable.
It depends on how we're defining each one of them. So I don't know. Unification, I'm used to, that comes up in a couple of contexts. Do you want to tell me what you have in mind for each?
No,
or
I mean,
based
just
on my
in general.
understanding of each? Unification, integration, and synthesis. So I think what's at stake for me is what I want to say we don't have is an aim to bring together our different explanations, or more broadly, our different, by and large, our different scientific products, right? The sort of things that we build in science to address different aims, right? It doesn't always have to be next stage. that could leave room for other kinds of unification, integration, synthesis. Synthesis in particular seems to be kind of generic to me. Like, so I can imagine lots of forms of, let's bring, well, I think this is true for all of those terms. There are lots of ways of working together that I think are unquestionably of value in science, and will remain so. So one of the ones that I've been really impressed by is, given what I think is given all of the importance that I accord to idealizations, I think it's really important to get so it's hard to say all this in the abstract, but to whatever extent for your project you need to make sure your idealizations check out. I think it's really helpful to talk to consult other research at that point, right? Because it's, by definition not what you're working on, so you can talk to people who do work on that and say, hey, can I just assume this here, or do your dynamics mess that up? And that's one example of, I think, what can be done. Or similarly, right, if you need to just set parameters, right? If there are people who work specifically on those dynamics, then they can be helpful in giving you the sort of machinery you need in order to set parameters for your work, stuff like that. I didn't answer your question at all, but hopefully it's
No, but that's helpful.
So let me add again that if you want to discuss with Angela, this is perfectly possible. Just stay here a few seconds, and time is out. So thank you very much, Angela, for this.
Thank you.